Okay, I'm going to create a voice memo here for you, Val, that you can listen to on your way back home. It's not going to be super well organized, but it'll be hopefully good enough to be a conversation point here. So the premise, the basic thesis is that corporate law, corporate HR law as it comes down from the EEOC, has functionally cock-blocked the truth by making people believe that all disparities are from discrimination. And we're going to reference Joe Biden doing a tweet on that today, gender-based discrimination, despite there just not being any evidence for it. But also, and that's caused by what's called the disparate impact, which is a thing that is causing the competence crisis, because you can't do any tests for competence. You can only do knowledge-based tests, even though competence and intelligence tests are better. They also tend to have disparate impact. And the more something has disparate impact, the more legally, it's basically the better the tests are, the more legally actionable are. So this has had undue influence on institutions. By and large, Americans support equality, but we don't really like the idea of quotas. So they've used some classic doublethink with the EEOC posters being like, yeah, you can't, we're not going to discriminate because we're equal opportunity, but we're also specifically going to discriminate using affirmative action. So they force everybody into a religious doublethink on those two topics. And that has had the government, corporate, and education influence on that has had just an incredible amount of impact on moral attitudes, because we've pushed them into we've pushed them culturally through policy. And again, the kind of the main things are of wokeness, as he describes it, are the disparity equals discrimination. We need to shut down anybody who says so, and we're going to have HR enforcers at every level, and we're also going to make sure that other employees are doing this. So the concern about stereotypes have morphed into denial of biological reality. Part of this is just basically fear of litigation, and the ability for class action based on disparity and feelings of disparity. Some of the things in the timeline are going to basically be 1964, which is 60 years ago, the passage of the 60 years ago would be the Civil Rights Act, and 1991 was the update of that. It was a new Civil Rights Act that expanded some things. But basically what the government has done is they have outsourced social engineering to corporations and law firms and other organizations by basically making human resources the commissars of correct think. One of the big problems that the conservatives have had, according to some people, is this myth of the marketplace of ideas. if every single institution that is a corporation is incorporated under the government or sanctioned under the government, they are going to be subject to these EEOC rulings and compliance issues related to them. And that has the precise effect of a chilling effect on free speech, because the organizations are concerned about litigation relating to harassment, because it's harassment to stereotype people. Given the fact that stereotypes have some basis in reality, it's why they persist as stereotypes. All of these government-sanctioned institutions and the government force of this social engineering have generated a de facto secular theocracy, wherein the lawmakers are, the law is the sacred text, and it's interpreted by government agencies and bureaus, and then locally there are these priestesses of human resources. And there's kind of a combination of political, legal, and bureaucratic enforcement. The disparate impact becomes potentially actionable, and repeatedly what ended up happening was people on either sides of the issue, the far left and the far right, were intellectually honest. The far left saying that they wanted quotas, the conservatives saying no, that would be illegal and unconstitutional and nobody likes it. And because it was politically unpalatable, what it did is it forced them all to lie. Basically, in Rehnquist versus Michigan, we basically did quotas under what is called winks and nods. Under Nixon, it was this idea that, quotas are bad, but timelines and goals are good, right? So just depending upon how we call them. And the decisions on these were moral. They weren't necessarily coherent. And the way the agencies enforce them is different. There's a book called The Invention of an Idea. And it's about how diversity was just sort of like this thing that was just kind of invented as a value. It hasn't always necessarily been a value. The civil rights movement is kind of an outlier. Typically, violence or property destruction in a movement tends to be bad for the movement. In the case of the riots of the 1960s and the riots of the 1990s, and then further in 2020, what the social movements found out was violence and property destruction actually helped them get what they want. So it became, for practical purposes, a shakedown racket. And so the legislature would make these compromises on things, but the bureaucrats would ignore the congressional record as to what was actually supposed to be happening, and they would do this, again, wink and a nod thing, but it's this coerced and incoherent ideology that affects the legally permissive permissions, and any disparities become prima facie evidence of injustice. I guess his idea is that this comes from is that publicly a lot of people are talking and thinking as if this is something that comes from the colleges and universities. With some certainty, this is where the commissars are trained. But the enforcement of the ideological coercion, the support structure around controlling the speech is very corporate and very government driven. It's been codified into not necessarily law, because the law says that discrimination by sex and race and sexual orientation is legal, but in practice they've forced organizations to do it. And so there's a level of sophistry related to all the dumb words that they use, and they've made a moral struggle since the very founding of this movement. Now, more broadly in the culture, everything related to the civil rights movement on television, that sort of changed things in the television and the movies. Everything has made this out to be like, oh, this was this great struggle. Well, it had an intention of solving problems for poverty and access in the American South for blacks. But it's had this unintended set of consequences, as is very often the case. Not to mention scope creep. What was originally set up after World War II, hypothetically, is we want to make sure that black people have access to profiting off the war effort. By 1969, it became, we're going to enforce this affirmative action, but it's never going to be at the risk of competence. And as that went on, of course, it did. And then by 1991, they added in rather than race, they added in sex as it was originally put in to be a poison pill. It was a joke, right? Like, oh, well, obviously women are going to be negatively affected too, so they're going to want to put them in there. And that was put in actually as a joke. And then it got in, and very quickly, that movement decided to find the parallels between sex and race. However, those bumped into some very real problems. One being, are you going to let women into the military? Are you going to let them be police? Are you going to let them be firefighters? And because there was an ideological movement of educated people obsessed with power, they forced their way into that conversation. And we came up with police people, peacekeepers, and firefighters, right? Policing the language along the lines of, again, sort of reducing the competence level, getting rid of height restrictions, because if you're going to have women and Hispanics and Asians, you can't have height and weight restrictions. Even strength things, you have to make reasonable accommodations. Disparate impact makes everything potentially legally actionable. Let's see. In 1970, in a big picture sense, it's every government contractor, government agency or government contractor has to comply with this set of rules. Anyone with over $50,000, any organization with over $50,000 in federal government business is forced to comply with this set of rules. Every subcontractor that does $10,000 is forced to comply with this set of rules. So between all of those, the government, the contractors, and the subcontractors, that makes up 24% or so of all of the full-time employment in the country. And all of the other companies are required by mandate to look to other companies to see what they're doing as far as enforcing these things. So you end up having not just a groupthink within the government agencies, but a requirement that inter-company policy is doing that. So you've got company to company to company. They're all sharing best practices about how to enforce this social engineering. And then because of the nature of the anti-harassment law, you actually have other employees policing each other. So you've got the government doing policing, you've got HR doing policing, and then you have different corporations competing to do the policing. And furthermore, you've got employees policing each other, and that's making companies forced to be obsessed about the classification of people by race and gender and all of these different things. And just that idea that the organizations are forced to do this thing is causing the organizations to be structured around it, but then also their enforcement causes employees to do this. And so everybody who's in the corporate sphere, particularly if they've been through 14 years or 16 years or 18 years of these institutional enforcements, which is, for practical purposes, most of it is subjective analysis of objective results. And they have to make reasonable efforts, but reasonable efforts isn't really defined, nor is what is actually considered harassment. What are the kinds of things you can't say, right? What are the things that constitute this? These are left up to this independent analysis. And it's this sort of placement goal doublethink, right? Which is, well, we need to make sure that we're being diverse, but we can't really say what that is. And they're prohibited by law from being explicit because we can demand results, but not quotas, right? We can have goals and timelines. Those are mandated, but we can't say what those goals and timelines are for it. So it's this infinitely unattainable specification. We're an equal opportunity employer that makes the assumption that the dense, detailed ideas and the basic principles of the rule of law decisions should be made without concern to without concern to race, but we're also going to make all of these accommodations and goals for protected classes. And what ends up happening is these become like rituals. They become these repeated things that we say over and over. The government contract process, and the general obfuscation of the project, right? So we're not saying what it actually was. People aren't even aware that this is all downstream from the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Because if they were, they'd look at it and they would read it and they would say, wow, this is this is contradictory to the actual law. And this is sort of to the Mark Cuban thing. Is Mark Cuban he's a billionaire who runs companies, and he's a thought leader, and he's out there, and he's specifically saying, it's good business to do these things. And the EEOC commissioner is like, yeah, but it's also illegal, right? And people don't really know this, right? So it's like there's the executive orders in the law and practice versus the intent of the law and what it was actually set up to do. Placement goals are not quotas. That's sort of the famous one. Let me see. Yeah, you have to get whatever you have to do to get results, right? Affirmative action is whatever you have to do to get results. Well, what does that mean? What does results mean? Again, back to subjective things, because they can't just say what it is they mean, because what they mean is illegal, right? And so by definition, they're forced to do the things that they're not supposed to be doing at all under Title VII. Let's see, it's a bunch of... Yeah, this was another thing that sort of got cooked into it, that your intent, this is under disparate impact, your intent to discriminate was not relevant. So if you put a test and your test was aimed at getting predictive results and outcomes, but it ended up having the unintended consequence of discriminating, that was still legally actionable. So the intent to, if we put in an intelligence test, it ended up having disparate impact. It didn't matter whether our goal was to implement it to be discriminatory or not. If it had that outcome, it was going to be legally actionable. And this had the effect of creating numerical hiring, where they swore hand on heart that was never ever going to happen. So, give me a second. There was a situation where, I'll get the exact specifics of that, but basically the EEOC asked the NAACP not to appeal something, and the reason they didn't want them to appeal it was because if they did appeal it, it would come up that the legislative intent was to never outlaw these types of tests, because these tests lead to they lead to disparate impact, but that's because of the nature of the tests. They are discriminatory against less competent people, and there was always a promise that you would never be able to. You would always be able to pick the most competent person for the job. And so there was a conflict there, and the EEOC specifically asked the NAACP to just accept the limited win, because if they went into it, they would be at cross purposes with their social engineering goals. And so this is sort of back to this incoherent set of rituals that we go through, which is wokeness, right? It is this incoherent set of rituals and language and chants relating to, for practical purposes, we'll call it a moral landscape relating to protected classes being preferred over the evil white men, right? So that incoherence is a set of, basically a trade-off between legal compliance and being legal compliance versus legal compliance versus competence. And so for practical purposes, has allowed white men at the top to screw white men at the bottom. And current practice is so far removed from the law as written and understood as to be completely indiscernible. But it's enforced under pain of law. So these laws have put us into a culture of absurdity, because the culture and the law is affecting the culture is affecting the law, is affecting the culture. And so we're told on the surface that we are not supposed to give minority preference, but then we're also explicitly demanded as a culture to do so. So sexual harassment law, which is Catherine Ann McKinnon, explicitly, due to a couple of books she wrote, posed a war on stereotypes and an enforcement of this social constructive view of gender. This is a centrally planned culture. So much like a centrally planned economy is going to fail, arguably centrally planned culture is going to fail. Not to mention the fact that it is also a war on merit and pluralism. What if you happen to be a company that wants to have all black workforce? Or you want to have an all male workforce, or you want to have an all female workforce? This would technically be illegal to even test. Now, there was a contract. There was sort of an idea that affirmative action would be a social contract that would reduce social strife, but that turned out to not be the case. And what we ended up getting was, frankly, activists who used extortion and cancel culture to enforce this war on merit. And we ended up getting more social strife in the 60s, even after the largest bill in history, to be able to do this. And what we're back to is functionally the spoils system of government, where it's not necessarily the most competent people, it's the most connected people. And we're specifically excluding people because testing competence would be illegal. So it's intelligence versus validity and diversity, not to mention ideological standards. So it's objective standards, tests, versus subjective preference. We want to make sure our companies look a certain way. Like, that seems to be the objective thing. So there's soft quotas and a fear of lawfare, validity versus subjective feelings. Let's see, the EEOC and, of course, the actual black letter law is in conflict, and there's an explicit hostility to merit-based standards. There's a coalition of departments starting in 1972, which is the Department of Justice, the EEOC, and the CSC, a bunch of alphabet agencies. It's a coalition that grappled over a disparity standard. It's like, do we want these objective standards? Do we want numeric hiring? Do we want merit? Or do we want representation? Let's see. There's a bunch of legal examples. It is the diversity versus delivery trade-off. The most predictive tests are the most targeted by the EEOC. So again, we're back to central planning. It's decentralized information and preferences versus planning from a central authority. There is no marketplace of ideas. It's basically individual or corporate company preferences versus government fiats, and it's a combination of college indoctrination and HR policy. So, and we get to the problems with communities, right? Like, are the Hmong in St. Paul, they're the same as the Chinese and Indians? Are American Indians from the Mid-Wahpeton tribe the same as those up in White Earth? Are the ruling class from Spain, are they somehow the same as Mexican immigrants? Are trailer trash from Oklahoma the same as lawyers from Ivy League schools, right? Just because of their same color. So it's like that's obviously insane. What they do tend to like are these personality tests, which the personality tests, they can rig them specifically in a way that says, oh, this is our corporate fit. But what they end up getting is basically more groupthink, because personality, while legal to test for, because you won't have disparate impacts, however, it reduces viewpoint diversity because personality predicts political persuasion. So, on yet another vector, they've got testing that allow for testing that can create more and more problems in society, not fewer. Let's see. They have this tendency to it's a constant tendency towards group preferences versus individual tensions, right? So it's, oh, this person's a group versus this person is an identity, but they tend to collapse identity onto a single dimension, right? Who are you as a person? Are you a woman? Oh, you're a white woman. A woman, in order to not be stereotyped, must be, closer to you, a more career-driven woman versus a family-driven woman. The family-driven woman can be discriminated against. The one that fits the social engineering stereotype, sort of the liberated corporate slave, right? She's actually okay. Let's see, goals and timetables versus quotas. We mentioned that before. That comes up again. Let's see. Yeah, there have been a bunch of Republican presidents. They've never done anything about it. They get to define racism as it conforms to, they get to say that Republicans are more racist because Republicans don't support these policies, but none of the Republicans have done anything to change this. Apparently, nearly every affirmative action policy that's come up for referendum has failed. It's deeply unpopular. But if you do palatable lies and shut down political discourse by calling your opponents moral perverts, they're racist, they're sexist, they're misogynist through these sort of corporate shit smears, you can accuse them of things that can be used against them in a legally actionable environment, corporate environment. So these dishonest pseudo-experts and faux sophisticates let's see. They have when the white lies don't work because they're not believable. Anger among, what it does is it ends up causing anger among those who were promised things, and resentment among, anger among those who were promised results, and resentment amongst those who never bought in. Anger amongst those who were promised results, and resentment among those who never bought in. Some of these rules are mandatory. Some are, even though they're deeply unpopular, and some are illegal. So we've got generally an influence of education systems, corporate policy, government coercion, and 60 years of social engineering based on blank slate notions of race, gender, and sexuality. They're all enforced by religious HR commissars.